This is an unusual talk for me. It's going to be interdisciplinary, something that's brand new to me. I'm going to be part mathematician, part historian, and a little bit of a psychologist along the way. And I was trying to think about how to get this talk rolling, and I came to the realization that over the course of my life, I've been really lucky. I've met a lot of interesting and important people, from Jimmy Carter on down to Dick Butkus. But the only person I ever met who had a children's book written about him was Paul Erdös. It's called The Boy Who Loved Math. And it's the only way I know that I could ever have appeared in a children's book. I appear on page 30. Most times I would have thought I would have been on the cover of the children's book with a big X through my face saying, "Stay away from this guy." Anyways, how am I going to approach this talk? I'm going to first try to give you an overview of Paul's nature as a human being, and then I'm going to try to go into some particular details about his life and build up from his childhood on till his death. Along the way, I'm going to have to talk a little bit of math, but I will try to protect the innocent. And I will try to explain why I think Paul was the person that he was. And I think in some ways it's pretty easy to see some of the things that caused him to be the person he turned out to be. Time magazine called Paul the Oddball's Oddball. Now, why in the world would they do that? Well, for most of the second half of his life, he had no permanent residence. He also had no job. Now, you would say, well, I can go to downtown Atlanta and pick out 50 people that fit that category. But Paul never spent a night on the streets. He never actually really spent a night away from people. There were hundreds and hundreds of mathematicians around the world who were anxious to have him visit, to take care of him, to put him up in their homes. So there must have been something about this guy besides his mathematical genius that made him important to people. And I think it's fairly easy to see that he was a kind person. He was a generous person. We'll talk about some of the things he did along the way. Paul had no desire for property. That meant nothing to him. He traveled the world with 2 suitcases and a briefcase. And the 2 suitcases weren't even full most of the time. And one of them carried a collection of notebooks because he was always taking notes. The fact that he admitted that he never buttered his own bread until he was 21 probably helped Time magazine along the way think that he was an oddball. He never married. He never claimed to ever have a girlfriend along the way. He never drove a car. So there were a lot of reasons why Time said what they said, but they didn't really understand the man. At least I don't think that they did quite as well as the people who knew him better. Well, now let me try to bring up. Okay, so here's Paul as I remember him. I met him for the first time in 1976 at a conference in Michigan. I was just a lowly graduate student working the conference, and he was one of the major speakers. And I drove him around a few times. I talked to him a little bit, but at that point in time, I was mostly in awe of the man. I didn't really think of him as a friend, and I'm sure he didn't think of me as a friend either. You'll notice that I labeled him here as Uncle Paul because people who knew him well quite often called him Uncle Paul, because that's the way he tried to treat most people, like he was their favorite uncle. And Paul Nejbachi is Uncle Paul in Hungarian. So Paul had kind of a sense of humor, a dry but interesting sense of humor. For many years, when he corresponded with people, he would write a signature line of PGOM, which to him stood for poor great old man. Now, he was probably writing this when he was in his 40s, but he was always concerned about age, aging, and death. And we'll see, I think, why as we go here. After a while, when he hit 60, he added an LD after the PGOM, and he said it stood for living dead. At 65, he became an archaeological discovery. At age 70, he said he was legally dead. And age 75, he added CD for counts dead. Now, why he thought he was an archaeological discovery or legally dead, I don't know for sure. But the counts dead was the fact that the National Academy in Hungary had a limit of 200 members. But when you hit 75, you could still be a member, but you didn't count against the number of members. So when he turned 75, he essentially opened a spot for somebody else. And that's where the counts dead came from. Now, Time magazine thought that the only thing he ever cared about in his life was mathematics. And so certainly he was super driven by mathematics, as we will see along the way. But Paul also liked to play ping pong. And he was a pretty good player. He didn't have quick feet, but he had really quick hands. And he was actually also able to perform some coin tricks for children. When he would meet a child, he'd put a pile of quarters on his hand, on the top of his hand, pull his hand out and grab the quarters out of the air because he had fast enough hands to pull that trick. And here's a picture of him at a conference playing ping pong. Now, there are a lot of quotes that are attributed to Paul. One of the first was that, why are numbers beautiful? It's like asking why Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is beautiful. If you don't see why, someone can't tell you. I know numbers are beautiful. If they aren't beautiful, nothing is. That's pure Paul. And if you were interested in that quote, you can go online, look up Paul Erdös t-shirts, and you can buy a t-shirt with that picture and that quote on it. Another thing he said all the time is, my brain is open. And that meant that he was ready to do some math. Let's talk. So quite often, after dinner, he would look across the table at you and say, my brain is open, which meant let's get back to work. And he could work. He was 37 years older than me, and he could work me in the ground every day. He just had more endurance than I could ever imagine having. One of my favorite quotes from him is the following: that television is something the Russians invented to destroy American education. Paul would certainly think that. Now, there's one more quote that isn't quite as famous, but Paul said it the first time he walked into my house. He walked into my house, and we had a little dog who came running up to him, wagging her tail. And Paul said, vicious hellhound, please don't eat me. I'm old and my meat is bad. My wife immediately ran through the room, scooped up the dog, ran her up to the bedroom, threw her on our bed and locked her in. Now, the dog was happy as could be because she wasn't usually allowed in there on the bed. And I didn't find out till later that Paul would say this to every dog he ever met. But it was pure Paul as he looked down at her. And you can see how vicious she looks. Here's Paul in 1958 when he was 45 years old, in contrast to the first picture you saw. And some more of what I like to call Erdös speak. Paul often joked that he wanted his epitaph to read, I've finally stopped getting dumber. He was always concerned about losing his edge. He had his own language. So some more Erdös speak. Boss meant wife and slave meant husband. Because he would watch other mathematicians say, well, I have to quit working. My wife needs me to go home. So they were the slaves and she was the boss. Epsilon meant child. Epsilon has become, over the years in mathematics, the symbol epsilon typically means a very small number, something well less than 1. So because it was a small number, epsilon became a child. Sam was the United States and Joe was Russia. It's Joe for Joe Stalin, because Stalin had an influence on Paul's life. And well, so did the United States in many ways, and as you'll see later. The SF was the supreme fascist, and that Paul was God. But to preach had nothing to do with religion. To preach was to give a math lecture, because that was, in essence, Paul's religion. Noise was non-classical music. Any other kind of music just was interfering with it. He liked, at times, to listen to classical music. Poison was alcohol. He rarely drank, but I can say that at a dinner party at my house in the late 80s, where I was hosting several Polish mathematicians and Paul, and serving some nice wine, Paul had more than 1 glass of wine and loosened up like I had never seen him before. So I may be the only one who ever got him to drink more than just a sip of wine. And Paul talked all the time about what he called the book. So what Paul would say is that the supreme fascist had a book that contained the very best proofs of every possible theorem. It was Paul's belief, as most mathematicians believe, that mathematics is a fixed truth and we're just digging around trying to uncover the facts. And every now and then, the supreme fascist would let us get a peek into the book and we'd come up with a really book proof, the best proof possible. And if Paul told you you had the book proof for something, then he had given you the highest praise he could give you. And he would always say that he hoped that when he died, that the supreme fascist would let him read the book after he died, but he was afraid that he might only get a glimpse or two. And we would tell him that if he got to read the book, then he had to come back and tell us what he had seen. Another interesting thing about Paul, I like to call it the 6 degrees of Uncle Paul. So you probably had heard of the old tale about 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. If you were in a movie with Kevin Bacon, it was the 1st degree. If you were in a movie with somebody who was in a movie with Kevin Bacon, then it was the 2nd degree, etc. Well, before there was any of that, there were Erdös numbers. If you wrote a paper with Paul, you had Erdös number 1. If you didn't write a paper with Paul, but you wrote a paper with someone who had Erdös number 1, then you had Erdös number 2, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, I have actually had people ask me if they could write a paper with me so that they could get their Erdös number increased, or decreased, sorry. The Erdös number project is a website devoted to this and much more about Erdös. It's loaded with tons of info provided by the American Math Society, and there is the address if you ever care to take a look at it. They continually update it. In fact, they queried me just a couple of weeks ago about a couple of my PhD students so they could get them included in the numbers. Here's the most unusual, and I had almost forgotten about this, but my wife reminded me. There's a church in San Francisco, St. Gregory, that has 90 what they call dancing saints painted on the walls. And there's a picture of Paul as one of the saints. He is dancing in between Gandhi and Martin Luther. There's a further image of what that looks like. And as I've said at the top of the slide, you should keep in mind, Paul did not dance. Now, I have no idea how he got on the walls of this church. I have real doubts he ever entered that church. But somehow, he is one of 90 dancing saints. And it's just sort of mind-boggling. And most people don't even, most mathematicians I know don't even know this fact. All right, let's start to do some facts about Erdös. He has over 1,600 research publications, by far the most of anybody in the previous century, and probably the highest of any all time. More amazingly, he has over 189,000 citations to his papers. These are numbers supplied by the American Math Society, and those only count citations for papers that the Math Society has in their database, and they don't have all his papers in their database. He had over 500 different co-authors. And that tells you something about Paul. He liked to work with people, and the more the better. He was always happy to meet a new person and try to engage them in some sort of discussion. If they were mathematicians, it was going to be mathematics. But besides that, he was actually interested when he would meet a new person that wasn't a mathematician. He would begin a little bit of questioning to try to find out why they did what they did instead of doing math. And he was pretty good at it. I saw him do this a number of times. And he actually really liked people a lot and was concerned and really, really wanted to understand about these people as he met them. Now, this like of people had a major effect in mathematics. His influence really changed the nature of mathematical research. Before 1940, or at least up to 1940, more than 90% of all mathematical papers were single-authored. But Paul's influence from the 30s on until his death, in fact, even on till today, changed that a great deal. I mean, he had 500 different co-authors, many of them repeated many times. But he promoted a social nature to doing mathematical research, having people talk to each other, to get together and solve problems. He wanted knowledge to appear, and he didn't care who really got all the credit. He just wanted to see more and more results appear. So he promoted this for 40 years. Almost every talk he gave was a list of problems he wanted to see solved. And on many of these, he would put dollar rewards. If he thought the problem was easy, maybe it was $10 or $25. A little harder, maybe 100. Very hard, 200, 500, 1,000. And he paid off whenever somebody cracked one of those problems. My colleague Wojciech Rudel, at the last I knew, held the record for collecting the most. He had solved at least 50 Erdös problems that got money rewards. But that was Paul. Let's hunt down the knowledge. Let's work together. Let's talk about this. And let's spread the news. Now, Paul had big trouble at times with both Sam and Joe. We'll see exactly what those problems were, but it was always centered around personal liberty. He had an unbelievably strong belief in personal liberty and fought all attempts to control his life in any way. This was even kind of evident when he was a child. When he was about 6, he and his mother stood on the balcony of their apartment looking out at the streets of Budapest. And it was a bad time at that point. And he was seeing Jewish people being beaten in the streets. And his parents were both non-practicing Jews. So after witnessing this, his mother said to him, "Do you want to convert?" And as a 6-year-old child, he said to her, "No, I must be who I am." And so he never considered a conversion. All right, a little more about Paul. Paul had major influence in a lot of areas of mathematics. Number theory is where he really got his start, followed by geometry. There are people who call him the father of combinatorics. Combinatorics is a very new subject. It considers discrete topics rather than infinite topics. And he has had major influence in that. Graph theory is part of combinatorics, and he had supreme influence in graph theory and improbability theory. And some of the things he developed have had terrific influence in other areas, especially computer science. Computer science now, one of the hot topics is randomized algorithms. And that all grew out of Paul's work. And he's also had influence in topology. But I'll save you from that influence. All right, facts. Paul was born March 26, 1913 in Budapest. He was the son of 2 high school math teachers. So you can start to see where the math was going to come from. His parents, as I said, were non-practicing Jews. But here's what I think was the biggest influence in his life, something that decided much of what was to come. His 2 older sisters died right around the time of his birth from scarlet fever. I've heard different accounts. One account said they died a couple of days before his birth. Another account said they died a couple of days after his birth. I have no idea which was actually true, but it's close enough that right around the time of his birth, his family faced major tragedy. This had a huge influence on Paul's mother. She lived in fear that Paul would contract something and die as well. This is obvious from the way she behaved for years. Here's the viewing of the street beatings in Budapest when he was 6. And even as a teen, he began calling himself old and declining and began speaking about death. And I think it was because this cloud of death hung over his family in his early years. And as I said before, he also had a great fear of losing his mental abilities. Even as a teen, he would make comments about that. Another big influence was the fact that he was born in 1913, but his father became a Russian prisoner of war in 1914 and wasn't released until 1920, 2 years after the war ended. To survive, his mother was forced to continue to work, so he was left home a lot of time alone. Some of the time, he had a German nanny taking care of him. And it was clear from his comments about her that he didn't like her. They did not get along, but she did teach him to speak German. By the age of 3, he could multiply 2 3-digit numbers in his head. I gave up doing that at birth. At age 4, he figured out that negative numbers had to exist, and he did this on his own. I don't know too many 4-year-olds who are capable of that. He could also ask a person their birth date, and if they knew the time that they were born that day, he could then compute in his head how many seconds they'd been alive. So he had a pretty good calculator running. A lot of computer companies would have been happy to have that calculator. Now, his mother's paranoia continued, so she often kept him home from school for entire years because she kept having this fear he would catch a fatal disease. So this really kept him much more isolated. And I think this played a role. Here's my psychology part coming in. I'm sure this played a role in his desire to reach out to other people. And the best way he knew how to do that was through his mathematics. Here's Paul as a child, supposedly about 9 years old. Here's Paul with his mother. She ended up traveling with him for many years as he would go from place to place doing work and giving talks. And she ended up dying on one of their trips when they were in Canada. And that certainly was a big effect again on his life. She had played such a major role, doing everything for him as a child that she could, protecting him in every single way she possibly could, that losing her had to be the biggest blow that he ever felt. All right, so how about his lifetime passion for numbers? Once his father got back from the Russian prison camp, his father taught him about prime numbers. So, in case you don't know, a positive integer is prime if and only if the only divisors of this number are the number 1, which divides all integers, and itself. So no other numbers divide that number evenly. For example, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13 are all primes. There are an infinite number of primes. Primes are the building blocks. These are the subatomic particles of mathematics. They're the building blocks of the integers. Every integer is the product of primes. And so primes have long been a subject of major interest to many mathematicians. Paul got hooked, probably by the age of 10, on primes. Legendre, who's a famous mathematician around 1800, was the first to give a predictive formula with no proof on how the primes were actually distributed among the integers. Gauss refined this, and in 1849, he produced a formula, actually an infinite series, for those of you who might have seen this in a calculus class, but I'm not going to push it on you. He produced this infinite series that was going to tell you how the primes were distributed. Eventually, once this was proved, it became known as the prime number theorem. Roughly, and I'm leaving out a bunch of the infinite series part, what this theorem says is that the number of primes less than or equal to the integer n is approximately n divided by the natural log of n. The natural log is the power to which the constant e must be raised in order to produce the number n. So this essentially says that the probability that any integer whose value is at most n is a prime number is about 1 divided by the natural log of n. In 1949, Paul gave the first elementary proof of the prime number theorem. It had originally been proven independently by Hadamard and Poussin in 1898. Now that's 50 years almost after Gauss stated the formula, so there was no easy proof. Up to that point, until Paul's 1949 proof, every proof that had been developed used very powerful, deep mathematical results. Hadamard and Poussin used something called the Riemann zeta function, which is a god-ugly function. If my career in mathematics had depended on the Riemann zeta function, I would now be telling you, do you want fries with that? But Paul was able to produce a very elementary proof that you could show to freshmen. And this was a big, big step. Paul really loved these kind of proofs. This was a book proof to Paul that he had created. Now, what kind of awards did Paul receive? Well, in 1951, the American Math Society gave him the Gould Prize in number theory. Right, the Gould Prize is given every 3 years. This is 2 years after his elementary proof of the prime number theory that he gets this prize in number theory. In 58, he won the Hungarian Science Award called the Kossuth Prize. This is given every year, and there may be multiple winners because it covers multiple fields. But the big prize was in 1983, the Wolf Prize. At that time, it was the most prestigious prize in mathematics, and it carried a $50,000 cash award. Out of that $50,000, Paul kept about $700, and he gave the rest to, I'm forgetting which school in Israel, probably the Technion, but he set up a scholarship in his parents' name with the rest of that money. Again, the money meant very little to him. Also, over the course of his life, he received at least 15, I know of 15, honorary degrees, including Emory in 1995. And I believe we were the last school to give him an honorary degree. He died in 96. Well, despite calling children epsilon, as I said earlier, Paul loved children. He was always happy to speak with children and to try to entertain them. Here's a picture of Paul with Terry Tao. Terry Tao is now a superstar mathematician at UCLA. Many schools have tried to pry Terry Tao away from UCLA. He's probably the highest paid academic mathematician in the country, and UCLA isn't going to let him go. And from what I've been told, his wife isn't going to let him move either. So he's there for life, but he is a major superstar. And there's Paul with Terry when he was about 8 or 9. And you know, because of the paper and pencil, they're doing math. All right, some facts from Paul's teen years. He finally was able to make a few friends as a teen, but they were all strong math students. It was through his mathematics that he began making friends. These friends included Paul Turan, George Sekeresh, Esther Klein, Tibor Gali, and Albert Renier. Turan became a major figure in number theory. Sekeresh and Klein got married and did a lot of research in geometry. Gali in graph theory, Renier probability. In fact, the Mathematics Institute in Budapest is called the Renier Institute. So all these people went on to have big careers. Here's Paul with Sekeresh and Klein, longtime friends. So this was well past their teen years. This is Paul Turan. And here's a quote from Renier. If I feel unhappy, I do mathematics to become happy. If I am happy, I do mathematics to keep happy. So he fit right in with Paul, no problem whatsoever. And they were longtime friends and research partners. But let me back up just a bit there. So as I said, Paul did a lot of work in number theory, starting with Turan, in geometry with Sekeresh and Klein, in graph theory with Gali, probability with Renier. Those were major areas, excuse me, where he did his work. Here's another sort of interesting person that he met. At 19, Paul was introduced to Simon Sidon, who was a very reclusive mathematician in Budapest. Paul later described Sedan as a good mathematician, but a bit crazier than average. Now, Sedan invited Paul to come to his apartment so they could talk mathematics. So Paul and Tehran went together to visit Sedan, who gave them the following problem. What is the longest sequence, A1, A2, A3, ... of positive integers less than or equal to a value capital N, such that all the sums AI, AJ are distinct? So you take any two numbers from the sequence, add them together, and you get a brand new value. That's what Sedan's question was. Paul's answer to him was, I don't know, but I'll return in a day or two with the answer. That was Paul's confidence. He answered the question 20 years later in a paper with Tehran. The two of them finally found an answer, and that answer was approximately the square root of n is the longest length of the sequence. This question, with Paul's imagination and his ability to change the question into new questions, has become a research area in combinatorics called Sedan sets nowadays. And there are still papers coming out in this area. All right, Paul was a quick study. He entered college at the age of 17 in Budapest, and he graduated with a PhD at 21. So 4 years through undergraduate and graduate school. I'm surprised he actually was that patient. Paul was renowned as being a little impatient. All right, to continue, we need a little excursion further into mathematics. So I'm going to have to tell you what a graph is. So a graph is a collection of points. In this case, I'm indicating them as these dots. Their location is immaterial. And it's followed with a collection of two-element subsets of these values, these points, which we can indicate as lines joining the two-element subsets. Now, the blue, red, and green here has no meaning other than it looks good on the screen. Okay, so here's an example of a graph that has 10 points or vertices and 15 lines. Now, back in 1930, a man named Frank Ramsey proved a really remarkable theorem that essentially says, I'm not going to say it in the mathematical detail, what the theorem essentially says is if you're given any system of objects, mathematical objects, where that system is large enough, it contains enough of these objects, then any given specific subsystem you want must exist somewheres in there. So how large that system has to be is dependent on which subsystem you're looking for. Okay, well, that's a very general statement. What Ramsey's result essentially says is, well, complete chaos really doesn't exist. Because you can, if you go out far enough, you can find this subsystem that you're looking for that's nice and put together the way you wanted it. Now, Paul was able to apply this principle in graphs many, many, many times in an area now called graph Ramsey theory. Paul loved this area. He wrote many fundamental papers in this area. And the first paper I ever wrote with Paul was a Ramsey problem that I proudly am able to say I suggested. And Paul jumped on it right away and goes, yes, we must solve that. So let me try to explain a little bit about what graph Ramsey theory is. So the first kind of graph that people are always interested in are called complete graphs. Given p vertices and all the possible pairs of edges between those vertices. So here's a complete graph on 3 vertices. I call it K3. It's a triangle. On K4, 4 vertices, 6 edges. K5, 5 vertices, and the 10 possible pairs. Here the colors are meaningful, in terms of the K5 at least. So the very most basic graph Ramsey question is then, how large a complete graph Kn, and large meaning how big n has to be, how many points must there be, to ensure that no matter how we randomly color the edges of this Kn with two colors, let's say those colors are red and blue, we either find a red triangle or a blue triangle. This is the baby very first question. This value is denoted by R33, R for Ramsey number, 33 for two triangles, two K3s. It turns out the difficulty for finding these Ramsey numbers of complete graphs grows at a remarkable rate. It's easy to show that the Ramsey number for two triangles is 6. You need 6 points. Why isn't 5 enough? Take a look at the K5. Take a look at the red cycle. It's a 5 cycle. It has no triangles. Take a look at the blue edges. They form a 5 cycle. So there is no red triangle and there is no blue triangle. But once you get to 6, there's an easy pigeonhole principle argument to show that you can always force either a red triangle or a blue triangle. I won't put you through that argument. The Ramsey number jumps to 18 for two K4s. And by the time we get to two K5s, it is still unknown. The best that is known is that the Ramsey number for two K5s sits somewhere between 43 points and 48 points. But the number of possibilities in that range is so large that even today's computers cannot handle it. This kind of problem happens all the time in discrete mathematics, and it's known as the combinatorial explosion. Now, to find the exact value of R66 seems hopeless right now. 5.5 may fall as computing continues to improve, but R66 is going to be so much worse that nobody, I certainly won't be alive at the time anybody ever discovers it. And what Paul used to say about R66 was the following, that if an alien race ever came to Earth and said, you have 1 year to tell us the exact value of R66, or we will destroy the Earth, then Paul would say we should all prepare for the end. Okay, a major advance by Paul. He developed what is now called the probabilistic method. So Paul produced a remarkable result, providing a lower bound on this Ramsey number, RKK, and he did it using a probability argument. He essentially showed that once things got bigger than 2 raised to the k over 2, you had to be able to find what you wanted eventually here. This is an old result, but it still stands as the best lower bound. Now from this, Erdös and Rennie got together in '59 and developed what are now known as the Erdös-Rennie random graphs. There's two equivalent ways of looking at these graphs. The first model is take all the graphs with exactly capital N vertices and consider them equally likely to happen. And so they each have a probability of 1 divided by capital N of being selected if you were to select a graph. An equivalent model is to start, I shouldn't say P here, but insert with a certain probability P, insert an edge between 2 vertices of these N vertices, and do this operation for all such pairs. So you pick a pair, you roll the dice, and you see if you're going to insert the edge or not. And the graph that's finally produced by this process is called the random graph, even though it's not one particular graph here. It's really a model, a probability model. So this idea caught on big time. And this Erdös-Rennie random graphs have been used to produce properties of graphs that fundamentally say, with this probability, If the graph grows large enough, then we almost certainly have a property appearing, whatever property that is you're interested in. So this is part of the idea that has spread into computer science with randomized algorithms, using these random models to produce results with high probability outcomes. All right, so now the start of Paul's homeless journeys. In 1938, he realized war was coming to Europe, and he could see the anti-Semitic wave growing in Germany. So Paul left Hungary for the United States. He got a position at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where he had a fellowship, and he spent a number of years there. He got to know Einstein and a lot of other great minds who were at the Institute. And this is also when he began traveling to other schools to do research with other people. Here's where Paul starts to run into trouble with Sam. August 15th of 1941, he was attending a conference on Long Island, and he had two friends with him, Arthur Stone and Shizu Kakutani. Stone was a British citizen, Kakutani Japanese. But this is prior to the start of America in World War II. So they, on one of the breaks of the conference, decided they were going to take a walk near the water. So they drove down to the shore, stopped and started walking, and I'm sure they were deep in a mathematical discussion. And I know they did not notice a keep out sign, so they walked right past it. And they began to approach a shortwave radio station. And the guard came out and he told them to leave. So they immediately turned around, got in their car and drove away. But the guard panicked. He called police saying that 3 Japanese spies were trying to get into the station. A little while later, the 3 of them were arrested while they were sitting and having lunch in a restaurant. The headlines the next day, the Daily News, said 3 aliens are nabbed at a shortwave station. The Post was a little less ridiculous. It said that the FBI defeats a spy scare. The 3 aliens were just students. They were questioned, they were released, and they returned to the conference. But now Paul had an FBI file that would come back to haunt him later. Now, from the Institute, he went on to teach at Notre Dame for 3 years. And when asked if it bothered him to teach at a Catholic school, Paul had a typical Paul answer. He said, no, but I find it strange how many plus signs they had displayed. This was pure Paul. So after 3 years at Notre Dame, Paul went to Madison to teach at Wisconsin and to work with Stan Ulam. Ulam was a big shot in the Manhattan Project. The Teller-Ulam design of the bomb was the foundation for the development at the Manhattan Project. In fact, Ulam invited Paul to work at the Manhattan Project. Paul went there and had an interview, but he was turned down because Paul, being Paul, he answered honestly when they asked him, when the war is over, would you consider going back to Hungary? And he said, of course. And that immediately eliminated him. All right. So after the war, it was 1948 before he finally got back to his home. And his family had suffered a lot during the wartime. His father died of a heart attack in 1942, and 4 of his uncles were killed by the Germans. Happily for him, his mother, his Aunt Frida, and his best friend, Paul Turan, were alive. Turan and Aunt Frida had both survived labor camps. On that trip, he also met Vera Schoch, who became Turan's wife and is also a world-class mathematician. And while in the labor camp, Turan proved a major result in graph theory. which today is called Tehran-type extremal theory. All right, the start of trouble with Joe. All right, so Paul's visit to Hungary didn't last that long. Stalin began a crackdown, causing Paul to flee to England. And he bounced back and forth between England and the US, having managed to get back into the US. At about the wrong time, he accepted a position at Notre Dame in '52. And remember, this is McCarthy time. Notre Dame offered him an unbelievable position. They offered him a permanent job, teaching one class per semester, and he would be assigned a graduate student assistant whose duties would be to take over his teaching at the drop of a hat anytime Paul felt like that he had the need to travel. Paul turned it down. Now here's where his troubles with Sam increase. In '54, Paul was invited to the International Mathematics Congress. This is the big time meeting in mathematics. It's held every 4 years, and an invitation to speak there is considered the big time invitation. The meeting was to be held in Amsterdam, and Paul would have needed a re-entry permit to return to the US. And according to Paul, here were the questions. Does your mother have a great influence in the Hungarian government? His mother was forced to become a Communist Party member when they took over in order for her to keep her job. Paul's answer was no. He was asked if he had read Marx, Engels, or Stalin. He answered honestly, no. They asked him, what do you think of Marx? And he said he wasn't competent to judge, but no doubt he was a great man. He was asked, do you plan to visit Hungary? And he said, no, they might not let me back out. I'm planning to visit England and Holland. But his re-entry permit was denied, partly because of his FBI file from before, the allegations of him being a spy. Well, Paul being Paul and resistant to anybody controlling his life, he went anyways. Well, then he had no re-entry permit to the US, so he had to begin finding other places to be. So he began bouncing back and forth, England to Holland. And finally, he got a 3-month position at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He became a resident of Israel, but not a citizen. But he always remembered Israel as the place that gave him refuge at a time when he needed it. In '55, he finally got back into Hungary because many well-connected friends there argued he was such an asset to the world culture of mathematics that Hungary needed him. He, in fact, was granted a special passport that only he had at the time, which allowed him to leave and re-enter Hungary anytime he wanted. He didn't have to ask for permission. And this special passport was continued even after the Soviet crackdown in '56. In '59, a letter writing campaign by mathematicians got Paul readmitted to the US. And this began a very productive period where Paul would visit many, many places in the US and make many new co-authors. In '63, he met Ron Graham, who later became one of his primary caretakers in the US. And in '73, he went to Memphis to work with Ralph Fodry, who would become the other primary caretaker of Paul in the US. Now, there could not be two more different people from Paul than these two guys. These guys were both personable, outgoing, well-rounded. Graham became president of the American Math Society and later president of the Mathematics Association of America, the two biggest math organizations in the country. And he was also president of the American Jugglers Association. And he was very good on trampolines. He wrote a book about magic tricks. This guy, I think, could do anything he felt like doing. Ralph Fodry, also a very well-rounded person, loved sports. I played tennis with him many times. He went from being chairman of the math department at Memphis to dean. to a long run as provost, a year as acting president there, and then back to provost before he finally stepped down and went back into the math department. Ralph wrote 50 papers at least with Erdös. Graham wrote, I believe, 28 papers with Erdös. There's Graham with Paul, and with Graham's wife, Fan Chung, another world-class mathematician. They met at Bell Labs. Graham ran Bell Research Labs for a number of years, where he built up a major group of mathematicians. Unfortunately, that group was torn asunder when Bell was forced to split. And there's Ralph. Ralph was one of my dearest friends. In fact, I wrote 70 papers with Ralph. Here's a group of us, that wasn't my first visit, but back in 1984, I was visiting Memphis in March. Mike Jacobson, who's second from the left, was also visiting from Louisville. Ralph Fodry in the front row with Paul between us. Directly behind Ralph is Dick Shelp and Cecil Rousseau, two other Memphis combinatorialists, and Stephen Burr on the far left, visiting from New York. I didn't know Erdös or Burr was coming. The other five of us had a plan to work, but those two guys showed up, and so it became seven of us working. And this is a true story. As I said, I suggested a Ramsey problem, and we began working on it. And about the fifth day of working from 8 in the morning till midnight, I had a pounding headache. And we were in a giant classroom that sat several hundred. And the noise at the front of the room from people arguing over what to do next was getting to me. So I went all the way up to the back row, closed my eyes, and I just was trying to let my head quit pounding. And Paul climbed all the way up to the back and sat down next to me, and he said, Gould, do you feel sick? And I said, I have a bad headache, Paul. And he said, I have a powder. And he came back and gave me this powder, which I took, and my headache disappeared immediately. And Jacobson came up to me after I took the powder, and he goes, you know he took amphetamines for a number of years, don't you? Why are you taking a powder from him? And I said, my head hurt so bad I didn't care. I don't know what that powder was, but it worked. Anyways, the best part of this story, we're down to the last day I was going to be there. I was leaving, Jacobson was leaving, Burr was leaving the next day. And we were stuck on one point. It got to be lunchtime, and Ralph said to Paul, Paul, let's take a lunch break. We'll tackle it after we get a little rest and some food. And Paul said, no, you guys go to lunch. I'll have this done when you come back. And we went, come on, Paul. We've been stuck for 5 days on this point. He said, no, just trust me. So we trusted him. We went off to lunch. When we came back, we said, all right, Paul, convince us. And he went to the board and showed us how to finish it. And then we said, all right, now tell us the truth. And he said, it started to bother me that I'd seen something like this before, similar. And so I finally figured out that back in 1932, I needed a step that looked something like this, but I couldn't remember how I did it. So I went to the library while you guys went to lunch, and he looked it up, saw what he needed to see, and figured out how to finish what we needed. That was, since he wrote that paper many, many years before I was born, I have to be thankful he was working back then. Here's the same group at dinner. There was a birthday party for Paul that night, and Fodry had invited in several high school teachers and students at a school that Paul had given a talk at. There's a whole big group. Many people brought him presents. When they left, he went around with Jacobson and I trying to give away all the presents. He went to Burr and tried to give him aftershave. Notice that Burr has a beard. I mean, he was just trying to give away all these things that he'd been given because he didn't need them or care. All right. Here's Paul the night before receiving his honorary degree. He's talking with Hank Aaron. You can see Gary Houck sitting across the table from them. This is a wild story. So my whole goal that evening was to get these two guys together to see what would happen. In my pocket, I had Hank Aaron's book and two baseballs that I wanted to get autographed. When the party started, there was a big party, lots of people, and a big long line that I stood in to finally get up to Aaron. So I got to talk to him a bit, told him what a fan I was and how his World Series appearance in '59 had gotten me hooked into baseball. And that I wanted to introduce him to one of the other honorary degree recipients. And he said he'd be happy to meet anybody, but let him clear the line first. So I said, okay, fine, sir, I understand that. So when I started to go back, Paul had walked out of the big room in the museum back into the little restaurant area room. And he was sitting there kind of alone. So we went back and said, are you feeling all right, Paul? And he said, well, my heartbeat is kind of rapid. He had suffered this many times. His heartbeat would shoot up to 150 for no reason. So he was sitting there. We got worried. We ended up with the dean of the med school and a cardiologist looking at him. They called for an ambulance. And I looked at my wife and I said, damn, I'm never going to get Aaron to meet Paul. And she said, let me handle it. So while we sat there with Paul and the doctors, she walked off, and 2 minutes later came back with Hank Aaron, and the two of them were talking and laughing like they'd known each other for 20 years. So I got Paul and Aaron together, sitting at this table, and Paul being Paul, and I had warned him that this guy was a former baseball player. His first question to Aaron was, why don't you play baseball anymore? Now, Aaron was somewhere between 55 and 60 at the time. And you could see in the picture he had glasses. And he took off his glasses and he put them on the table and he smiled. And I thought he was going to say something about his eyes, but he didn't. He said, well, you know, when I throw the ball, I just can't throw it as well as when I was young. But that's not the reason. And he said, you know, when I run, I just can't run as well as I did when I was a kid. But that's not the reason. So the reason I don't play baseball anymore is when I hit the ball, it only goes to the warning track. Now, I understood that, but I will bet every penny I have, Paul had no idea what a warning track was. But he accepted it as the reason that Aaron didn't play baseball anymore. And they went on to talk to each other about where each of them was born and raised until the ambulance showed up and carted Paul grudgingly off to the hospital, the Emory Hospital, where he proceeded to make the lives of several nurses unpleasant for a while. By the time he got to the hospital, his heartbeat had returned to normal. There's Paul the next morning, going up to get his honorary degree. Bill Chase said to me later that Paul was everything we told him he would be. The entire time he sat on the stage, until he got up to receive his honorary degree, he was reading a math paper. He wasn't going to waste all that time sitting there without thinking. Now, I have one other Paul story to tell you before I quit. I'm already way over time. In the early 90s, Paul started visiting Emory much more frequently. He would come 2 or 3 times a year. And during one of those visits, he would work one day with my colleague Wojtek Rudel, the next day with me, and back and forth. This helped each of us stay a little fresher and able to stay with him. He and I worked for a week in there and we didn't get anywhere. And Paul flew away. The next day I was in my office and the phone rang and it was Paul. And he said, Gould? And I said, recognizing his voice, I said, yes, Paul. He said, do you know your triangles problem? And now I'm sitting there thinking, triangles problem? In all the papers I have written, I have never put in a problem about triangles. And I said, the only problem about triangles I can think of is I had recently given my graduate graph theory class the problem of determining the extremal number for two triangles that shared one vertex. So I said, Paul, do you mean the two triangles sharing a point? And he said, yes. And I said, well, what about it? And he said, have you considered K triangles sharing a point? And I said, no. And he said, I'm coming back. And he hung up. And the next day, he was back. And we worked on the problem of the extremal number of K triangles sharing a point, which became my last paper with Paul. Now, after he hung up, I sat there in my office for a moment, and my first thought was, how the hell does Paul Erdös know what problems I gave in my graph theory class? I mean, I know he's smart, but come on. So I thought about it for a while, and I said, there's only one student in this class who would have the nerve to ask Paul how to do that problem. It was a student named Dave Gunderson. So I went down to Gunderson and I said, did you ask Erdös how to do that problem? And he said, yeah. And I said, what did he tell you? And he said, he looked at me and said, induction. And he went, ha, and waved his hand at me, like I was an idiot for not knowing. And I said, well, Paul's coming back tomorrow, and you're going to work with him and me on this problem. And he did. So he got himself Erdös number one by asking Paul how to do his homework. And with that, I'll quit. And then let me get rid of this and get up participants. Any questions?
That was great. Hi, that was very good. I think I enjoyed that immensely. During his time at Princeton, as you said, he talked with Einstein, but did they ever work together? Einstein was still wrestling with a number of problems at that time and was having big problems with them.
They did not work together.
Yeah.
They just had many conversations, but what Einstein was doing and what Paul's real interests were kind of far apart.
Yeah.
But Paul was proud of the fact that he knew Einstein and got to talk with him a number of times.
It was said that Einstein had this tremendous imagination and could envisage physical structures and so forth in a way that very few people could. But he was not the greatest mathematician. This was said about him. He sought help with both, certainly with the general theory, not with the special theory.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, Paul certainly could have helped him mathematically, but I don't think he could get Paul interested.
Yeah.
Gretchen.
Thank you.
Hi, I too enjoyed that enormously, Ron. Thanks so much. Well, certainly from what you've told us, Paul Erdös, and I would say you yourself, are evidence that what I think a lot of us think is true just isn't true, namely that mathematics is a young man's game.
Actually, it's almost the opposite.
It sounds like it. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, according to the American Math Society, the average research mathematician publishes 7 papers, but the vast majority have 2 or fewer. And the 2 or fewer typically are from their thesis, and then nothing else happens. And nowadays, if you look around, the well-established people who are past 40 or 50 or more are continuing to do work, racking up lots of publications, advancing the areas. I mean, I've never believed that. I don't. Now, my first paper at Emory ended up being a big paper and opening up an area, a sub area. And it's been cited many, many, many times, not near as many as any of Erdős's papers, but in the hundreds. But that wasn't the end of my career by any means. And I don't see that my career is necessarily over even now.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say it's clear from what you say about Paul and from what I know about you, especially everything you've done since you retired. I mean, you older folks, it's not the big bucks, right? And it's
No,
not the big fame. You just love it. So
that's it. And it's mostly, if all it was me sitting home alone working, then maybe not as much would have happened by far. But I was indoctrinated into the social aspects by my thesis advisor, who was also a co-author of Erdős's, and liked to work with people. And I got used to that. And I don't have more than 500 co-authors. I have 90 co-authors. So it's always been that I work with people and I enjoy the work with them. And with guys like Fodry, it went beyond just the working together. Half the time we were teasing each other or laughing and having a great time while we were doing the math. His wife used to call me up when he was provost and say, "Hey, Ralph's been having a bad week. You got to come to do a math camp," which meant come and do work with him, take his mind off of being provost. And remarkably, the whole time he was provost, he continued to publish. And then we don't see that coming out of too many Emory provosts. They all promise.
I don't see another hand, so I'll ask my follow-up question. In your teaching experience, have you had as many young women coming along in the field as young men? What about women mathematicians?
The numbers, I think, are up to about 20 to 25%, somewhere in there. I have had a number of women PhD students, including Ralph Fodry's daughter, Jill. And I don't even know the exact count of the number of female PhD students I've had, but 3 of my last 4 were females.
Ursula, a question.
Ursula and David. Hey, David.
So hold on. Here we go. We've talked about this before. I'm not a mathematician and can't ask any question in that direction. But as you remember, when Erdős got his honorary degree from Emory together with Hank Aaron, the third one of the people involved in that also was Alex Gross. And I'd just like to share the story once more. Alex Gross was a Hungarian Jew who got deported from Hungary eventually in the ghettos and then to Auschwitz and then the forced marches, came to America, built himself up a construction company, never, of course, had any high school education at all, only got his equivalency degree when he was in the US Army in Korea afterwards. But Alex was one of the first survivors to speak openly and clearly about the Holocaust, and he would tell his story all over the state of Georgia. And since we had established the Holocaust program here, and Deborah Lipstadt had been brought in to teach it and so on and so forth, it seemed proper that Emory should give him an honorary degree, although certainly not for any scholarship and certainly not for any donation to the university, but just as a recognition of his moral courage in confronting the subject and bring it up. So there was a dinner somewhere during the weekend of graduation at the president's house. And there we are standing in the reception room in Lullwater with this huge fireplace, which is taller than any human being, champagne being circulated and everybody talking animatedly with one another. And Erdős wandered off and is standing there looking at the books because he really wasn't interested in the socializing. And Alex walked up to him, and the two of them just sort of looked each other in the eye, and they knew. And after a brief introduction, they switched into Hungarian. And here are these two men, survivors of the Holocaust, standing there in this epitome of Atlanta high society dining room, living room, and talking about the Holocaust. And it just was a moment out of history, really, that moment.
Yes, I remember you saying this story before. Looks like Vernon's got his hand up.
Ron, how did you get all the information about Paul Erdös that you have gathered?
A little bit of it was from Paul himself.
Okay.
There's also a biography of Paul called The Man Who Loved Only Numbers by Paul Hoffman. This came out a few years after Paul's death. I have an autographed copy, and I'm quoted in here as well. There's a second biography of Paul. My brain is open. This one I don't like as well because it cites that his final honorary degree was from the University of Georgia in 1995. The idiot never talked to me about it. He just heard that he was in Atlanta, and he thought University of Georgia was in Atlanta, apparently. They're very similar books. I think Hoffman makes fewer mistakes. There are a couple mistakes for sure, but I think Hoffman makes fewer mistakes. And I've had and read this book a couple of times, and I went back through it in preparation for this talk.
Other question I wanted to do about his residence. If I understand right, then it was these two mathematicians to whom you referred who kind of told him, our house is always open to you.
Well, he certainly stayed with them many, many times, but wherever he went, he stayed with people. He stayed in Atlanta with me at times.
Yeah.
He also stayed with Richard Duke, who is a mathematician at Georgia Tech. People in Canada, he would stay with. People in Japan or China, he would stay with that he knew. He knew people every place. And he always stayed with people. My wife liked to say that Paul Erdös didn't sleep here. He spent the night, but he didn't sleep.
Very good. Very interesting. Yeah.
Larry Vogler?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'm not a mathematician either, but I'm curious, is there an infinite number of insoluble math problems, and how do a group of you get together and decide which one you want to tackle next?
There is a group of what are apparently insoluble problems, known as NP-complete problems. They're not proven to be unsolvable, but most people believe that to solve these problems would require algorithms, and nobody believes right now, or at least very few people believe, that actual polynomial time algorithms that could run in reasonable time exist to do these problems. Now, how do we get together and decide on a problem? Well, typically, if you're working in some subfield and you know your field, then you know what's been developed and you kind of know what should be next. And quite often it's a building process. In the last 2 years, I've written a sequence of 3 papers on the same subject that built and built until the third one finished the subject. So it's just knowing your field. And this is part of the problem for the younger people coming out. They haven't been taught how to do this. My thesis advisor was great in that anytime I would ask him a question, he would say, there's always another question. Nothing's ever dead. Just look at it the right way and you'll find a way to change it and ask the next question. And that helped me quite a bit along the way. I've been able to find my own problems to work on my entire career. And that's a big step. It's the people who come to you and say, do you have a problem I can work on that you know are in trouble?
Okay, thank you.
I thought there was another hand, and it seems to have gone away. Anything else I can help anybody with? Gretchen?
Yeah, it was just me, and I won't pursue it, but I was curious again as to how he lived, not just in terms of where he stayed as he was traveling around, but what money he used.
Okay, I can partly answer that. He was getting $5,000 a year from the University of Memphis as a honorary professor, even though he never taught anything there. But he visited there so often that he had a big influence on that department. And once, when I was in Memphis and he came in, the very first hour after he got off the plane and we were sitting back in the office, Ralph Fodry dumped a big pile of mail in front of him. And Paul asked me to help him open his mail. So for the next hour and a half, I opened envelope after envelope with honorariums, reimbursement checks. I mean, there was a pile of 30 or 40 checks in just that one mail. And again, Paul didn't have a lot of need for money.
Yeah.
And he would give it away. One of the stories is at one point, I think when he was at Notre Dame, I could be wrong on this, but he cashed his paycheck in a bank and walked out, and a hobo came up to him and asked him for a handout. So he kept a few dollars out of his paycheck and gave the man the rest of his paycheck because the man needed it. And there was a famous Indian mathematician, Ramanujan, who died at a very young age. He probably made a mistake in leaving India and going to England, and he contracted something and died in his 20s. And Paul never met the man, but he sent money to his wife to help her out after his death.
Wow.
That was the kind of guy Paul was.
Well, I'm so glad to know about him, Ron, and it's just been a splendid presentation, and I thank you so much. Gray probably wants to wrap it up, and some of you may want to hang around and chat a bit more with Ron and with one another.
Right. So thank you very much, Ron. I'm just wondering, is there an Erdös number for people who hear a talk about Erdös, for a person who has an Erdös number 1?
Well, we'll start that today.
Okay. Thanks again so much. And people are welcome to stick around and chat with one another. I'll leave the meeting open. And thank you again, Ron.
So, hey, Jonathan Hogan, you're going to have many, many more years to do wonderful work, aren't you?
That's the plan. The hope.
Nice to meet you, Jonathan.
It's very nice to meet you. Thank you very much for sharing about Erdös. So I sent Patricia a message, but I just wanted to say hello. I actually was at I went to graduate school at the University of Memphis.
Ah, okay.
So I got to know the Memphis 3 pretty well. So his Erdős's influence on the field, and then the influence from those whom he influenced directly is just it's amazing. It's a very, very wide and deep impact.
Oh yeah, no doubt about it. Hey Pat, how you doing?
Say again?
Oh, I was talking to Pat Fodry.
He's muted.
You got to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Is that better?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
There you go.
Now, this was this was really interesting for me. And Ron was right that the math camp kept Paul going, but kept these other guys going also. So we had him, and oh, there's Lynn. Hello. So it was a mutual admiration society. In fact, I wondered if other branches did as much collaboration as they did in this bunch. I don't know if they'd live
They
without
didn't used to,
collaboration.
but nowadays it's more and more.
Great. That's great.
And Liza has her hand up.
Hey, Ron, I enjoyed that very
Thank you.
much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was curious, you mentioned at the beginning that even as a team, Erdős was concerned or very interested in the concept of death and
Well, I think death hung over his family.
yeah.
With the death of his two sisters, his father being a prisoner of war for 6 years and his mother probably not knowing if he was alive or dead. I think she did a number on him,
yeah.
personally.
What about his own death? Did he know, did he have a disease or did he?
He died, well, he had heart problems. Once here at Emory, one other time when his heartbeat went very rapid, when we took him to the hospital, put a monitor on him. And he was supposed to wear this monitor. It was a big box and wires to it. He was scheduled to give a talk the next day, and he was going to give that talk no matter what. So he walks in and he puts the box on the table in the front of the room, and he turns to the board, he starts to write, and as he goes over this way, the box is sliding on the table like this. It comes to the edge, but it doesn't go off. And then he goes back this way writing, and the box is going this way. And the people in the front row are going like this. And this went on for an hour. Paul paid no attention to the box. He just presented problem after problem for people to think about. That was Paul's kind of talk. And most of the audience had a heart attack that day, but Paul didn't.
But he did later.
He died of a heart attack at a conference in Poland, I believe it was, in September of '96. And the day before, he had proved a theorem.
Wow.
But, you know, that brings up a question about, you know, when you talk about someone leaving and you living that way and not having much money and going from one place to another, in our society, it brings up the question of health insurance. I mean, you know, if without health insurance, he's taken Emory Hospital, you know, for cardiac, he ended up owing $100,000 or something. So did he have?
Luckily, he never spent a night in the hospital. It was just a visit.
But he had insurance.
Okay, that part I didn't know.
Yeah, we had some insurance here.
I was wondering about that. I mean, you know, in Europe, one really doesn't have to worry about that so much, but here it turns out to be a big issue.
He also, can I talk?
Yeah.
So in Memphis, we have a pretty good eye clinic, and some people there knew about him, and he needed a cataract, and they just did it for him. We've got a picture of him and his doctor. But I have a feeling that happened to other places also, that there were some people who knew about him as reputation, and they just serviced what he needed. I know that happened with 2 doctors in Memphis.
Yeah, there's supposed to be a funny story about that cataract surgery too.
Yeah.
He had an argument with the doctor because he thought he'd be able to read with the other eye while the doctor was doing the surgery.
True.
So they had a little bit of an argument before he finally agreed to the surgery.
Right. Yes. Right.
Ron, I was going to ask what he did for fun, but clearly he did math for fun. Did he do anything else for fun?
He loved ping pong. In fact,
oh, right. Yeah, you
the
said
way
that.
he met Ron Graham was in 1963 at a conference. Paul was playing ping pong and Graham challenged him. And Graham was 20 years younger. You know, Paul was like 50. Well, he was exactly 50 then. And Paul beat him badly. And it drove Graham nuts. He went back home, bought a ping pong table. This is kind of fanatic he was. And he made himself into a real quality ping pong player and eventually became New Jersey champion.
Oh my gosh.
But that's the kind of drive that he had. He's an interesting guy in and of himself. If you ever want to read something interesting about a person, look at his stuff on the story of his life online. It's kind of strange and bizarre, but not nearly as bizarre as Paul's.